Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a program for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes, or to suggest a particular topic or guest you would like to hear featured on the program. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Today, we're discussing the importance of Sabbath rest, and by connection, the healthy prevention of burnout. We know that ministry and missions can involve demanding schedules and high expectations, sometimes more opportunities to serve than is humanly possible. In our discussion with author Mark Buchanan, we're reminded today that God invites us to participate in Sabbath rest. We think this is an episode that will be helpful to any Christ follower, but we want to especially encourage mission workers, missionaries themselves, and mission committees to also consider what's said here. Perhaps you know someone that would benefit from hearing this, and we encourage you to send them a link from the website or recommend this episode to them. Before we get to the interview with Mark, we'd like to share with you this mission resource.
OMF is a global fellowship of Christians with a heart for East Asia. We pioneer life-changing ministries. We partner with like-minded churches and agencies. We pray and persevere in difficult places. To learn more about how you can join in God's work among East Asians, visit us at omf.org. OMF, Heart for Asia, Hope for Billions. And now, here's today's interview.
Well, hello again, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Our guest today is Mark Buchanan. He is an associate professor of pastoral theology at Ambrose Seminary out in Calgary, Alberta, and has served as a pastor in different churches in Western Canada. He and his wife, Cheryl, now live in Cochrane, Alberta, having moved from the West Coast to the interior a little bit. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Megs. Very happy to be here.
Well, looking forward to today's discussion. Mark is an author and a professor, of course. He's been published in a number of periodicals, including Christianity Today, and is the author of several books, including two that I have on my own shelf. The first, Your God is Too Safe, and The Rest of God, which is the focus of our topic for our interview today. Mark, I've appreciated both of these books. I read them some time ago and have been glad to review, especially The Rest of God here. 2006, which of these books came first?
The Rest of God is the second one.
The second book. Okay. Yeah. So Your God is Too Safe came first.
Yeah, that was actually the very, very first book I published.
I see. Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to learning through this too. It's a challenging book to read. I wonder if some of your readers have found it uncomfortable in the sense that it challenges how we naturally work sometimes. Our topic today will be Sabbath rest in missions and how we can help our workers avoid burnout. I would note for our listeners that this topic is going to be broadly applicable just about to any Christ follower. Would you say, Mark, it applies to all of us?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no question.
Mm-hmm. We will turn a little bit toward missions work, but I hope it'll be an encouragement and valuable to everyone who's listening in today. Well, Mark, let's begin with some definitions of sorts, please. Just lay some groundwork. In your book, as you get going, you talk about the term Sabbath, both being a day of the week and an attitude. Would you start us off just by expanding a bit on these ideas?
Yeah, the day of the week is obvious that 6 days shall you work, on the seventh day you shall rest. Now, I'm not a Sabbatarian in the sense that we have to observe that on a particular day of the week. Mm-hmm. The concept of Sabbath means to stop. And I think to take a day where you cease, you stop, you rest, you receive is important. But fundamentally, we're not going to be able to really receive that day or practice good Sabbath without what I call a Sabbath heart, which is about the attitude. And the foundation of a Sabbath heart is trusting God to run the universe when you're not.
So there's a certain humility that's connected to this.
Very much. I mean, in a lot of ways, before we are even in a place to really deeply enter Sabbath rest, it's an act of faith. That's the entire argument of Hebrews 4 when it talks about entering the rest. and that former generations didn't do it, but today you have the opportunity. But the argument is tied in explicitly and very passionately with the whole idea, do you trust this God?
Mm.
And so the cultivation of that, deeply trusting God to look after you, to look after your interests, to provide for you, to attend to those things that right now you're going to step back from, that's foundational.
Mm-hmm. It's a striking statement that you made, that we need to trust God to run the universe when we take a break.
Absolutely. My quickest definition of Sabbath is when we imitate God in order to remember that we're not God. I guess if I'd add another piece, in order that we might receive afresh all that we need from God.
Mm-hmm.
But, the Sabbath commandment in Exodus is, I created and then I didn't, or I rested, you should too. So it's an explicit call to the imitation of God's restfulness. Prior to that, humankind has been called the imitation of God's creativity, to go and be about doing that in the creation as image bearers that continues and cooperates with the work of God. But we're equally called to imitate God in his resting. So it's where we imitate God, but in the imitation, remember we're not him, which is, I think, the delusion we're liable to when we end up in a practice of never stopping. Even if we obviously stop to physically rest, if we never give our heart and our mind a break from the work that we do, which is, the greater hazard, that we can't stop thinking about our work. We can't stop attending to the thing we do for 6 days a week or our day job. And so it consumes us even in our moments of rest and idleness.
In other words, it's relatively easy to be physically still or physically rest. It's another level to have our minds and our hearts at rest.
Very much. Yeah, C.S. Lewis talked about the endless chatter in our brains, and it's somehow dialing that down, if not actually hitting the mute button on it.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree that maybe the physical stillness, the physical rest, is part of the process, though? How do those two fit together?
Megs, I think in a lot of ways that the core of Sabbath is twofold. It's receptivity, so it's a mode of receiving rather than producing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's attentiveness. So we start noticing things that we, in our busyness or rush, have become oblivious to. We notice our own heart. We notice our spouse. We notice our children. We notice our neighbor. So a lot of that receptivity and that attentiveness requires a certain degree of physical stillness. I want to be quick to add, some people, if they sit still, they just fall asleep.
Right.
Which they may need. But if the heart of Sabbath is receptivity and attentiveness, then going for a walk might be a better actual spiritual practice around Sabbath keeping than simply lying down or sitting down.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can do those things and still have all the noise going on in your head.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas sometimes if you go for a long walk on a mountain trail or through the woods or by the lake, and you really cultivate this attentiveness to what's going on in you and around you, and you really sort of receive it like a child would receive it, with wonder, with thankfulness, with a glad heart. Something about those two practices really allow us to cultivate this Sabbath heart and I think enter the Sabbath rest in ways that sometimes just physical rest are not going to do for us.
Right, right. I remember there's a story that you relate in the book of chopping wood, an illustration where, you said, well, should you chop wood or not on the Sabbath? And actually, you find it quite refreshing. Not everyone would necessarily. We're all wired up differently. But for you, that was freeing. It was exhilarating even, but you were doing. It's not necessarily doing nothing.
It's not necessarily doing nothing. And it may have, as a result, a certain productivity to it. Mm-hmm. So it's not that we have to go around legalistically or religiously avoiding producing anything. It's just that the purpose of it is not that productivity. So to use the cutting wood illustration, chopping wood, at the end of that exercise or that practice, I would have a pile of wood that, I could start curing for the fire next season. There's a product that comes out of it. But I found just the sheer joy and pleasure in being out in the outdoors, the physical motion of the axe or the maul down on the Douglas fir, the sounds, the textures, the smell of the sap being released, etc. I just learned to relish the actual being in the moment of that. The value of it wasn't in, I now have a pile of wood to burn. The value in it was, it became this practice of both attentiveness and receptivity.
It's a great illustration. One other quote from early in the book, actually, you say, "A Sabbath heart is restful even in the midst of unrest and upheaval." So there's something that can linger as well, right?
Absolutely. We often quote Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." If you look at the psalm is descriptions of all kinds of activity that God's up to on the earth, throwing mountains into the ocean and breaking weapons and fashioning them into plowshares, etc. So it's a depiction of a God at work, not God at rest. Mm-hmm. And yet the invitation is for us to practice stillness, which I'm suggesting is better understood as this openness or receptivity and attentiveness, if we're going to actually see and be thankful for the work that God's doing upon the earth. But also to say that it's an invitation to rest in the midst of a world actually that is not at rest, a world that's somewhat in upheaval, a world that there's a lot going on. There's a lot maybe that could distract us or could disrupt us. And in that context, we're invited to be still.
Well, let me turn then to ask a bit of your advice. If there's someone listening who is agreeing with this so far, I need to consider Sabbath. I need to probably have a better practice of Sabbath in my life. How can they step toward that? What advice do you have to get going to keep the Sabbath and to begin the rest?
Yeah, so some very simple things. One is, it would be good to develop some ritual that would mark out the beginning of your Sabbath and then the end of your Sabbath. A practice that goes back for centuries is a Sabbath candle, which as you begin your Sabbath, which I would strongly suggest should begin in the evening, that at least I think we need to mimic the practice of the Jewish people that began as the first 3 stars appeared in the sky on the Friday evening. So the concept of beginning Sabbath and evening is that you are already winding down, you're not winding up. And so you're moving toward a quietude, you're moving toward sleep. But to mark out that the welcoming of Sabbath by some small ritual, the Sabbath candle is a simple way of just lighting a candle to acknowledge that this Sabbath has begun. But you could find your own. It could be that you break bread together or something. But it's finding that entry point that actually marks this moment in time as distinct from. And there's a quality of difference between a Sabbath and the rest of the week. So there's some kind of holy ground that you're stepping into. And again, to mark that out. If you look at the practice of Jesus around Sabbath, it was his favorite day to heal. And his healings covered a range of things: physical, releasing people from a demonic oppression, people who couldn't walk or couldn't see or couldn't hear, restoration of these things. So I think it's a very good practice to, as you prepare for Sabbath, to identify what isn't quite working in your life. And it may be that you actually need a physical healing. It may be that you're so burdened by fear or worry that it's hampering your ability to find joy or effectiveness or fruitfulness in the work you do. And so I actually practice Sabbath of identifying those things and then humbly inviting Jesus to do for me what I can't do for myself. I can't seem to break out of this pattern of fear or worry. Would you show up as I rest in you and trust in you and do that which I can't do for myself?
It's a beautiful idea. Are there other practices that you have seen helpful to people? You've mentioned the attitudes there, reading. Perhaps I'm a reader, so perhaps I migrate there too quickly. But other things that you've seen people do that get them out of the gate, so to speak, into this Sabbath.
This is an oversimplistic formula, but generally, many people find that if you work with your hands, you should Sabbath with your mind. And if you work with your mind, you should Sabbath with your hands. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if your day job is talking, writing, lecturing, reading, then you may find that some element of gardening or woodworking or something, doing something with your hands, is a deeply restful thing. And vice versa. If you're a laborer, if you're a carpenter and you frame houses all week, the last thing you probably want to do on a Sabbath is go and build something.
Right.
But it may be the day that you set aside to do something that is, you read poetry or write poetry or something like that. That's just, again, it's overly simplistic, but I found that in general that kind of helps. But the one thing that's probably will be most helpful to your listeners is identifying the thing that most ties you into your day job. Is it your smartphone? Is it some kind of paperwork that as soon as you kind of look at that, all of the emotions, all of the inclinations to be engaged with that work sort of flare up? Whatever that thing is, if you could quarantine it for 24 hours, so let's just say it's a smartphone, and
Sure.
I'm not anti-technology, a pen and a paper, a piece of technology, so I'm not anti-technology. And for some people, to make a Skype call to their grandchildren on the Sabbath is the most blissful thing imaginable. So to sort of put a ban on any kind of internet connection or something seems to me legalistic. But let's just say it's your phone that you're constantly kind of tying back into your workaday world through that. What if you just actually powered that down and put it in a box somewhere and put the box in a closet that you know where it is when you have that panic moment, oh my goodness, where's my phone? That you just have to recall, oh yeah, I put it in the box in the closet. But you isolate yourself from that so that it doesn't have the power to keep pulling you back into the world where you're going to have to spend the rest of your week anyhow.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. I can imagine that some of our listeners are going to try this. I know one of them who might, although I'm not as closely tied to my phone as some. It's a great idea. And how do we just consider what takes us back into that busy, back into concern, whatever that includes for us. Well, in our North American society, too, most of our listeners are in North America. This Western culture seems to value being busy, being productive, being efficient. It's underlying a lot of the value. And of course, that spreads into the body of Christ, into the church, and into ministry, and into mission work. I wonder how this contributes, the lack of it contributes to burnout. Do you see that we need Sabbath? You've written a book on it, but are we on the right track here? We need to raise the bar on Sabbath?
I very much feel that. A whole bunch of reasons that would take way too long to give all of them. But I actually am more and more convinced, Megs, that Sabbath is the central discipline of the spiritual life. If you look at it within the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, it's the fourth commandment. 3 before are all about God. The 6 after are all about people. And in between is a Sabbath. And I'm more and more convinced that the sequence of those commandments is not random or accidental, that as our relationship with God goes, so do we trust in the God described to whom we're calling a relationship, with whom we have to do first 3 commandments about no other gods, no idols, and no vain use of the name. As we live into that relationship with God, it automatically will flow into an ability to rest and trust. If the Sabbath heart is about, do I trust God to rule the universe without me, then those 3 commandments are foundational to building that trust. And then you look at the 6 commandments that follow, beginning with parents and the neighbors and coworkers and strangers and all of that, and not murdering and not coveting and being in right relationship to the people closest to us. I think that those are overflows of Sabbath. It's interesting, for instance, in Deuteronomy, the 4th commandment, Sabbath commandment, is 133 words in the New International Version. And then do not murder is 3.
Mm-hmm.
Why would we need such sort of simple teaching on something so momentous, so of such magnitude of not murdering, and 133 words about Sabbath? Well, I think implicitly what we're being told is that if you keep Sabbath, if you're well rested, you're less likely to actually feel murderous.
Right.
And so there's this growing sense that I have. Recent book by Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament theologian, called Sabbath is Resistance, makes this point as well, that it is within the life of Israel, it was the premier spiritual discipline, Sabbath keeping, related to all those other things, non-idolatrous manipulation of God, etc., non-vain use of the name, honoring of the parents, etc. That this was the premier central discipline to all of those things. If that's the case, and I do believe it's the case, it is a supreme and sad irony that of all the 10 commandments that most Christians feel are optional, the only one is the Sabbath commandment we feel that we take a pass on.
Interesting. So what we consider maybe, or we take it the lightest, might be the core of the matter, in fact.
I absolutely think so. If I could just add one quick point, is that the Sabbath commandment is one of the few commandments with a rationale, or in other words, a reason why you should observe it. And the Sabbath commandment actually has two rationales. It has one in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. Exodus points back to the creation. I created, then I rested, therefore you should. And Deuteronomy points back to the Exodus. You were slaves, I came, I got you out, therefore you should rest. It strikes me that this double rationale for Sabbath keeping is implicit within it, is that if we don't keep Sabbath, we'll begin to forget our created nature and our redeemed nature, that we're made in the image of God and that we're redeemed by, in Christian terms, the blood of the Lamb. And if we keep Sabbath, it is almost built into it, is a weekly reminder of the true story that defines us, created and redeemed.
That's great. Well, to this point, in general terms, Sabbath is applying to any believer. Here we are on the Global Missions Podcast. We turn our attention a little bit toward global missions, cross-cultural work. What are some of the challenges that mission workers face overseas when it comes to making room for observing the Sabbath and watching for burnout?
Yeah, well, a couple that I've noticed over the years in pastoral ministry, especially as I've worked closely both with homecoming missionaries and then on the field as I've gone and visited missionaries, is that the cultural differences are striking, and often the expectations of a community of believers, say in Africa, the missionary is simply available at all times, anytime, night and day. You don't make an appointment. You just wander into their house or whatever.
Right.
And it's not sort of let's drink tea together, but it's I have a marital crisis or something, and I need your assistance in dealing with it. So there's a cultural piece here that I've just learned over the years to really have a lot of empathy for missionaries who are trying to sort of maintain some kind of boundary or rhythm that keeps getting interrupted or disrupted by certain expectations or lack of similar values in the culture they happen to be working. Mm-hmm. So I see that. And I think just generally missionaries are people who have decided, like the Apostle Paul, to pour themselves out like a drink offering, that there is this heart to serve that can sometimes, and I say this advisedly because I have, boundless admiration for those who choose vocational missions. Mm-hmm. But sometimes there can be a bit of a pathology underneath this heart to serve, where a person begins to derive their identity from that which they do. Mm-hmm. And the ministry that they're engaged in, their sense of worth and their sense of value connects with that. Well, that in any, doesn't matter what world you're living in and what vocation you have, is a ticket for burnout, because fundamentally we can't do enough and we can never do it good enough.
Right. Well, we're going back to what you said originally, right? We need to let God run the universe and not us.
Let him run the universe. And so there's a sense where I often look at the story of Jesus around Lazarus, first beginning where, there's this bid, come the one you love is dying, John 11. Mm-hmm. And Jesus just toodles around. I don't know what he does. He goes, and he doesn't show up. He's not in any rush. There's no urgency. Gets there and the guy's already 4 days in the grave. And of course, his sisters are full of heartbreak and a bit of blame toward him. Mm-hmm. And there's a sense where, just a pause at that moment, where Jesus is not in a rush. Now, he has resurrection power and he's going to call him forth from the grave. Mm-hmm. But he's not caught up in other people's urgency. And to sit with that and then take that insight and start applying it to many of the stories of Jesus, where he simply isn't being driven by another person's agenda. He's discerning what the Father's doing and doing that, but he doesn't feel an anxiety about, I got to do this and I got to do that. The way John Ortberg puts it is that the person on earth who had the least messianic complex was the Messiah. That he didn't, he's out to save the world, but he didn't act like it. He actually had lots of leisure time.
Right. That's a great point. Well, as we think of our listening audience, many of us are serving in churches that know these workers who are working very, very hard in some cases. If I could ask for your advice to the churches, to the missions committees, the senders who want to helpfully support mission workers, how can we be helpful with this?
Well, I would honestly say be as absolutely generous as you can, because a lot of people that I know in the mission field, aside from this extraordinarily onerous work schedule and demands on their time, is that they don't have the financial resources to enjoy just getting away with their spouse or what have you, or their family. And so I would really encourage those mission agencies and churches that are supporting to be as generous as you possibly can. The second thing is that generosity doesn't always have to take the form of remuneration, but somebody who's has a lovely cottage in some part, lake country near where you live, willing to, when that family comes, allow the family to have it for a couple of weeks of uninterrupted family time. With some of the missionaries that we supported when I was in pastoral ministry, we would actually look at opportunities for sending the missionary and spouse away within country or when they came back to Canada, and try to create those moments where we were on their behalf undertaking the cost of and almost kind of creating the space for them to simply get away and renew and restore.
To be generous is a great idea. Be on the lookout for signs of burnout in your workers. If I can put in an idea, communicating to these workers who have a very high sense of responsibility that it's okay to rest, communicating permission to rest, if you will, from home church.
Yeah, no, I think that communication of the permission, a proverb that has been foundational to my whole thinking in ministry and in life is Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, for it is a wellspring of life. And if we don't have practices that guard our heart, that renew and refresh our heart, where we care deeply about what we're doing, where we're falling fresh in love with our spouse, where we really are present with our children in a way that they don't become embittered and resentful later, etc. Above all else, guard your heart, for it is a wellspring of life. All your fruitfulness, all your effectiveness is going to come from that well-tended heart, which is precisely what Jesus says in John 15. If you want to be fruitful, it's not from effortfulness. It's about an abiding and a dwelling joyfully in his presence. And so this is the least selfish thing missionaries can do, actually, is have deep practices, sustained practices, extended practices of looking after their own wellspring.
Well, I was going to ask you next, if you could speak to the workers themselves, what would you say? And you've just said it. You're saying, care for your heart. It's the wellspring.
Yeah, and attend to that beautiful text in Matthew, come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. Let me give you rest for your souls, for my, take that yoke on you that's not working. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. That is an invitation for you, the missionary listening to this. It's Jesus opening his arms and saying, you don't have to get beaten down by this. Of course, it's difficult. Of course, it's calling forth, more creativity and energy than you seem to have. I will pour it out, but come to me. And to receive that and enter the embrace of the one summoning you to himself without any apology, because that's the heart of what it is to be a disciple. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Well, to our listeners, I want to warmly recommend Mark's book entitled The Rest of God, Restoring Your Soul by Restoring Sabbath. Mark, I wonder, are there any other books or resources that you would recommend to our listeners on the topic of Sabbath?
Yeah, very much. The classic book is by the Jewish rabbi philosopher Joshua Abram Heschel, and it's simply called The Sabbath. It's 125 pages, I think. Mm-hmm. You can read it in an evening, but you can ponder it for the rest of your life. It's beautiful. It's subversive. It's really the classic. The second book is, I made reference in the podcast, Walter Brueggemann's book, Sabbath is Resistance. Again, I think it's 80 pages, but every page is loaded with amazing insights. This is one of the premier living biblical, especially Old Testament scholars, who spent his life reflecting, especially on the Exodus event, out of which the Sabbath comes. And so this is, Brueggemann's in his 80s. This is the fruit of a lifetime of reflection, and it's potent. The third book I would recommend is actually by a non-Christian, but it's a beautiful reflection on what the Sabbath is about. It's by Wayne Mueller, and it's called Sabbath. And I found that as helpful as some of the other Christian books that I've read, just because he brings a lot of wisdom of the actual practice of Sabbath to the writing.
Very good. We'll have those 3 books mentioned in the show notes. So if you missed the titles, you can visit the show notes on the website there. Mark, we've just gone quickly across as an introduction this topic of Sabbath rest. If our listeners would like to learn more from you or follow you, contact you, how can they keep up with Mark Buchanan?
Yeah, I have a website, markbuchanan.net. And they could contact me directly at mbuchanan@ambrose.edu.
Thanks for being generous with that, too. This has been really helpful as an introduction. I hope that it stimulates some new thinking, maybe some renewed thinking if you've thought about Sabbath before. And Mark, I just want to say especially a thank you to you for participating and sharing this with our listeners.
Oh, you're very welcome. My honor.
Well, we hope you've been encouraged by this episode and have some practical ideas to consider regarding Sabbath for yourself and for some mission workers that you may know. Thanks for helping us to share this important episode with them. Remember, you can find the show notes on our website at globalmissionspodcast.com. As we record this episode, it's early 2017, and the GMP team, the Global Missions Podcast team, has just reached a significant milestone of 25,000 downloads. We want to thank you for being part of this and for listening today. If you've appreciated this program, would you help us spread the word? We'd appreciate a review on iTunes, as this helps potential new listeners understand the value of this broadcast, and you can subscribe there or Google Play, and you'll never miss another episode. As you know, we're always glad to hear from you with suggested topics or interviews you'd like us to consider. That's all for today. This Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the entire team, thanks for listening, and we invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.